My name is Dennis Fig. I run the security for World Wrestling, and one of our wrestlers that lives down there is missing.
Okay, what's his name?
Chris Benoit.
Chris Benoit was considered by many of us in the business as being one of the greatest workers in wrestling.
He was nicknamed the Rabid Wolverine, the Canadian Crippler.
They've tried to reach his wife, Nancy. She doesn't answer. They tried to call his house.
I plan on ruling the wrestling world.
She was in love, more in love than I'd ever seen her in my life.
This was during Chris and Nancy's wedding. Daniel was the best man, of course.
All right, we'll go ahead and send somebody out there to check on it.
Well, the wrestling world in shock today. Former champion Chris Benoit found dead in his Atlanta home along with his wife and young son. Police now treating the discovery as a double murder-suicide.
On June 25th, 2007, Chris Benoit's brutal murder of his wife and son dominated the news cycle, leaving the world searching for answers.
Going over it in my mind, like, why did this happen? How did it happen? Could it have been stopped?
Authorities say Benoit strangled his wife and suffocated his son before hanging himself in their home.
The term that's been being thrown around everywhere is roid rage.
When you look at Christopher Benoit's brain, it is in fact shocking.
For over a decade, those closest to the killings have been left traumatized and desperate for closure. For the first time, friends and family have come together to tell the story in their own words.
Chris was just this gentle giant, and I could never have imagined that he could hurt someone.
He was probably the greatest wrestler that's ever lived. And to have that same person have murdered your family, that's not an easy statement for me to make.
That's not the Chris that I knew. There's so many details that are so crazy to understand.
I need to talk about this. If you don't want to hear it, if you're going to give me shit about it later and say I'm glorifying a murder, stop listening now.
All right, you ready?
Let's rock.
All right, so first, can you tell us who you are?
I'm David Benoit, son of Chris Benoit. He's one of the greatest wrestlers of all time, I believe.
There's the cross, let you know! I love Chris Hurts here!
That was just his job. As soon as he got off the road, he was just dad. That was it, no matter what. My grandfather took him to his very first show in Edmonton. And then he saw the Dynamite Kid.
Against the Dynamite Kid, also 214 from Liverpool.
And then he's like, yep, that's what I want to do. My dad, he looked up to him. That was his idol. He emulated him, his work ethic, nothing like it. And then he would do his signature flying headbutt. He would climb up to the top rope, jump off spread eagle, and connect. Busted his ass in the ring every single night. Gave it 120%, no matter what. I got my very first Nintendo, and I had WCW Mayhem, and I played as him.
Chris Benoit was on the radar as a pro wrestler since, gosh, the 80s. I'm Jim Ross, got in wrestling in 1974. I'm now the senior advisor to AEW. I'm a wrestling fan, so if you're a wrestling fan, how could you not be a fan of Chris Benoit's work? He's always considered one of the best workers ever, even when he's young. He was just a natural.
My name is Chris Jericho. I've been wrestling for a long time, almost 30 years. Watching Chris Benoit was one of the reasons why I really enjoyed Stampede Wrestling and why I started really thinking, maybe I can do this.
Benoit's a rookie, but he does have the moves.
To watch Stampede Wrestling, you could tell that the guys were smaller guys. They were not as tall as the giants that you could find in the WWF. I thought, wow, like they're kind of my size. So in that aspect, someone like Chris Benoit was kind of an early influence on me. The most intense and believable performer I've ever been in the ring with. He could see things that would happen before they happened. His first job was wrestling, and his last job was wrestling. All he ever did was wrestling. The only thing he ever got a paycheck from was wrestling.
I was a huge fan of Chris Benoit right off the get-go. He's the ultimate performer. The Malenko. I wrestled for ECW, WCW, and of course WWF/WWE. Chris is very quiet, very reserved, you know, very serious guy, and kind of like into his own little world at times, but when that red light went on and that bell rang, Chris Benoit was a whole nother person. extremely focused, probably one of the most focused individuals I've ever seen in any sport for that matter. Chris took nothing less than being perfect.
I did a few tours with Benoit over in Japan, and we had a match. I gave him a spin kick, and I didn't hit him in the head with it, nor should you. It's wrestling. You work together to put on a show. He felt like he took it the wrong way. He felt that he exposed the business with his ineptitude. Meanwhile, I bet you nobody noticed anything because a quick kick goes by, you take a bump, it's not on TV, who cares? He cared. I found him in the back doing hack squats, like Hindu squats, where you just go up and down, 1, 2. And I go, what's wrong? He's like, oh, I messed up that kick, and I have to do squats now. I'm like, why? Who told you to do squats? Like, are you in trouble? Like, no, I'm doing them on my own. I screwed up. I'm doing 500 squats. That was him. It's like he had to purge himself and punish himself for making this minor mistake that to him was everything. And Eddie was like that too.
Wrestling fans, of course, all know who Eddie Guerrero is. To many in the wrestling world, he's considered as one of the absolute best wrestlers of all time. I'm Chavo Guerrero Jr., third-generation professional wrestler from the legendary Guerrero family. When Eddie was about 18, he started really training for wrestling, started wrestling all over Mexico, and then transitioned into Japan and became one of their top stars and was called Black Tiger.
He was this tall Mexican guy with long hair and cowboy boots and pants that were tight, and I loved his ass, and I thought he was the most gorgeous guy. My name is Vicky Guerrero. I am a former WWE superstar, and I fell in love with Eddie. He loved wrestling. He ate it, he dreamt it. He was always doing promos in the bathroom mirror. He was always showing me, hey, can I try this move on you and tell me if it hurts? Those were kind of fun days in the bed. I mean, I'm not gonna lie, those were good times.
Super nice, very friendly, would give you the shirt off his back, like literally, like you could just tell the sweetness just exuded from this guy. A little bit crazy, as any wrestler can be, especially from that generation. Very small, though. When we were in Japan, the referee, Hattori, used to call him the Mexican flamingo. Big upper body, small leg.
I think Chris and Eddie first met in Japan, if I'm not mistaken.
They would beat the shit out of each other, almost like they owed each other a lot of money.
Eddie would call me and be like, man, I can't stand this asshole. Like, he's such a prick, and, I can't believe I have to work with him for the next week or two.
I think even in today's world of wrestling, every company out there, they all go back and watch those matches. Those guys were like way ahead of the time.
I really wanted to be like those guys, that's why my name was Lionheart for so long. Because I wanted to be an animal like those guys. Eddie was Black Tiger. Chris was Pegasus Kid, Wild Pegasus. Those two just saw things differently. And that was part of what made them so great.
The more they fought, I think the more that they started, respecting each other, they hit it off, and they ended up just, being the best of friends.
These particular earrings are a pair that my sister wore as woman on WCW. I decided that I would wear what she thought would look good on camera. My name is Sandra Toffaloni, and I am the only sibling of Nancy Benoit. My sister Nancy was married right out of high school. Her first husband was a huge wrestling fan and got her to going to the matches, and she really liked it. There was a moment where, I don't know if it was a promoter or another manager that picked her out of the crowd. She's a beautiful woman. The first time it was just kind of like a weekend thing, and then it turned into something else. She met Kevin Sullivan in Florida Championship Wrestling.
Hey, let me tell you something.
He's probably one of the greatest promoters and bookers that's ever worked in wrestling.
Kevin Sullivan, who was this satanic character, and he was satanic because he shaved an X into his chest hair and put makeup on, That was about the extent of his Satanism, you know, he would wear a hood.
And they had an instant connection as friends, and then not shortly after that, were falling in love. She was already in the process of divorcing her first husband. So Kevin, he had this idea in his head to grow this gimmick of he's the Prince of Darkness, and he has this army of darkness behind him, and Nancy by his side as the fallen angel.
Welcome to Polynesian Pro Wrestling. I'm Angel, your co-host, and here's my master, Kevin Sullivan.
You know, Angel, you've done a fine job.
The name Fallen Angel came from the Uriah Heep album, and the cover of it had this beautiful woman in a leatherish bikini with feathers and a sword, and she looked at that cover and said, man, that's the gimmick.
She was good at what she did. Probably one of the first that really understood the art of being a valet or second, so to speak. She's an instrumental part in getting heat, as we like to say.
People would stop her. They recognized her. They believed she was possessed. She'd be getting gas, and they would come over and like, we're just gonna lay hands on you and pray for your soul. And she loved it because she knew if they hate me, I'm absolutely doing my job.
Because she wasn't a wrestler, but she was very valuable as a ringside performer. And that's a lost art. Now, there's no such thing, right? Every girl in the business has to be a wrestler. She wasn't that, but she probably knew the business better than most.
She did Kevin's makeup, she did her own makeup, she did everything, the hair, the staging, the clothes. The guys would break their tights. Nancy would be there with thread and needle. We had duffel bags full of boa constrictors all around the house.
In the beginning, how would you describe their dynamic, like what they saw like in each other, do you think?
Nancy and Kevin's?
Yeah.
Oh man. You know, he worshipped her, and she was all in with him. She was in love, and their dynamic was awesome. So they moved to WCW. It was a big step up, obviously, so, from what they were doing.
WCW, where the big boys play.
Dean Malenko, Chris Benoit, and Eddie Guerrero were the three amigos. All three of them came to WCW together.
What did they call this guy up north, the Canadian Crippler? Oh, my goodness! Did you see that?
Kevin was a booker at the time, booking productions, booking talent for storylines. Everyone kept talking about this really great technical wrestler that was coming out. I knew he was new to the company, and I know that my brother-in-law wanted to book him.
I just knew Nancy is the fallen angel character. Then getting to WCW, she was woman.
I am woman. So men, look at it, wish you had it, and eat your heart out.
Woman was the one character she was attached to because it was most like her actual personality.
I'm gonna watch your every move, Ric Flair. I'll see you at the Clash, big boy.
She's independent, she takes nothing from anyone, and gotta help you if you get in her way.
Ow! This one's for you. Whoa!
I know Kevin really, really liked Chris, really enjoyed working with him. And at that time, Kevin was booking Chris and himself into matches, and Nancy kind of became a part of it. Things were kind of happening a little weird, but nobody really knew what was going on.
Kevin Sullivan, it started out as you and I. And then you brought Nancy into it?
The joke in the business is that Kevin Sullivan booked his own divorce. It's funny to a point, then it's kind of not funny at all, because I'm certain that it was not meant to happen.
Starting in WCW, Dean Malenko, Eddie Guerrero, Chris Benoit, who all came in together, they loved it. They were happy when they were, getting some props, because even them being smaller in a sense, they were the workhorses. You could always count on them.
Benoit takes flight. He is on target with a swan dive.
So Kevin Sullivan, the booker, the story maker, writes the story and has this idea to have woman, who is Nancy, leave Kevin's side and start going with Kevin's arch rival, who is Chris Benoit.
What's it feel like losing the most important thing that you ever had?
WCW would film vignettes with Chris and Nancy being intimate together.
I'll tell you what, it sure feels great gaining it.
What they didn't plan for is that really happened. Nancy left Kevin Sullivan to go with Chris Benoit.
Kevin was used to her always being there and kind of being his right-hand person, and with her focusing on her own career, I think there were strains there. There were a couple of physical altercations in the house, fights that escalated.
Nancy would reach out to Chris whenever she would have a bad night with Kevin, and Chris was her safe haven, you know, where she would go wherever he was at.
Chris was going through problems with his wife at the time, so two people kind of gravitating toward each other because they were, you know, having difficulties.
So I got a call from my husband telling me that Nancy has had some problems and could I help her? I was working in a psychiatrist's office, and Chris brought her in to see me, and she came in and removed her sunglasses, and she had a huge black eye. She told me Kevin had done that to her, and I just told her that I'm help you in any way we can. We need to document this. I was really hoping to try to help her get out of that abusive relationship. I just saw it as being this gonna blow up.
Bash at the Beach was in Daytona Beach at the Ocean Center. It was Kevin Sullivan going against Chris. It was a great match, I thought, because it looked super realistic. And then at one point, Chris and Kevin really started exchanging blows. Chris hit Kevin really hard on the side of the head, and it broke his eardrum. The match ended, but the fight continued backstage. And I was called out to go backstage. I started to walk towards Kevin, and Chris was like, no, don't do that. And Kevin's yelling from the other end of the hallway, come on, come with me, we're leaving. Chris handed me the phone, and it was my sister on the other end. She's like, Sandra, get out of there, come home, come to the condo. Just go with Chris. Do not go with Kevin. And I always do what my sister says, so that's what I did. No explanation needed. I went to the condo. My sister came out to talk to me, and she was visibly physically hurt. She explained to me that her injuries were from Kevin, and that Chris had helped her, and that she was leaving Kevin. I told her she had to. Chris was a nice person, and all I knew about him was that he helped my sister in a time that she really needed it. So for that, he instantly had my thanks and my admiration. And she was in love, more in love than I'd ever seen her in my life.
The way they looked at each other, we're like, oh yeah, it's gonna work. And Nancy and I became best of friends.
Chris decided that he wanted to push his career forward a little bit, and then she just really wanted to focus on building the house and starting a family. And then all of a sudden, Daniel was born. I've never seen Chris so beyond himself, just excited.
This is my favorite page because this was during Chris and Nancy's wedding, and Daniel was the best man, of course. This is the love that Chris and Nancy always had. And then here's them feeding Daniel after they got married. And Nancy being the princess that she was. And David was there too, Chris's oldest.
David is the son of Chris Benoit from Chris's first marriage.
Nancy, she treated me like I was her own kid. We didn't use the word step in our family, you know. We were family. We went and had fun, went to Chuck E. Cheese with Daniel and Nancy, and, you know, it was good times.
This is my very favorite photo of David and Daniel. It's flippin' adorable. I mean, that's what siblings are. You hang on to one another and hope for the best for each other.
He looked up to me, you know? I loved him. I protected him. We wanted to be tag team champions. That's what we wanted to do. Be the tag team champions of the world together.
So in WCW, there was definitely a ceiling that you would reach.
The bigger guys were getting all the TV spotlights. If you weren't like 7 foot tall and huge muscles, you know, you didn't get the main event.
Happening at WCW at the time and never seeing ourselves in a main event spot because we kept getting pushed down. So we decided to take a walk.
I cannot believe this. Eddie Guerrero, Chris Benoit, Dean Malenko on WWF Raw.
They walked out, WWF picked them up in 1 second, and the rest is history.
When all three of them got to WWE, then you really saw the strengths.
I lie, I cheat, I steal!
Their intelligence for the business and their view of the business and seeing, like, we see this, they saw this. Eddie became one of the best characters of all time, as well as being one of the best in-ring champions. And Benoit became just this killer, you know, no-nonsense Clint Eastwood performer. It was like Dirty Harry. Go ahead, make my day.
Benoit, he's a rabid Wolverine. I'm telling you, Chris Benoit is heartless.
Chris Benoit's been a main eventer for years. It was only the matter that he was too short. Perceived as too short. Imagine that.
Benoit's a magnificent, extraordinary athlete.
I always thought, man, getting Benoit here, it's going to create these great matchups, and it did. It was a no-brainer.
But also, Chris was always very much a great father, you know, very much about his family. His kids were always high up on his list.
When Daniel got a little older, Chris would bring him to the ring. And of course, anytime when Chris brought the kids around, we'd all play with them.
It really pained him when he had to miss certain things. I remember at one point, I said something along the lines of, like, I gotta be home on Halloween. And he's like, oh man, I wish I could go home for Halloween, but I gotta work. And I miss Father's Day too. And like, I was like, dude, we'll just get those days off. And it's almost like he didn't want to ask for days off because, you know, sacrificing for his art, I guess you would say. And there's a similarity between Chris and Eddie in that both of them sacrificed a lot for their art. Chris and Eddie basically gave their life for pro wrestling.
For Eddie, wrestling was everything. God was first, and then family and wrestling were a close second.
You know, sometimes we'd be in the locker room and Eddie's naked in the locker room reading scripture to other wrestlers and telling them about God.
Chris wasn't religious at all, and Eddie was the one that started introducing him about God. And Chris was very receptive, and he always listened to Eddie. And Eddie had even given him a Bible one Christmas. And Chris always had that on him, and that was something that meant a lot to Eddie. To always be a witness to Chris, you know, and to help him try to find his higher power.
Chris was very quiet, very reserved, and it took a while for him to trust somebody.
Eddie would be his go-to guide. He'd go and talk to him about certain things, you know, whether it be marriage problems or family or professional problems. They'd always confide in each other, and that's what their friendship was. And I know that Chris didn't have that with a lot of people.
Chris, he was blowing up. He was getting bigger as a wrestler. And to have Nancy behind him, he was really happy. She was the driving force and motivation, sort of taking care of everything else that wasn't related to wrestling. She wanted him to be happy and to be successful and to be with his best friend.
Eddie was injured a lot. He had a lot of pain, a lot of injuries that, you know, he couldn't get operations for.
Eddie Guerrero is legal. Front splash, cover. It could be over.
And as a wrestler, you never say that you need time off, because as soon as you're off TV for 4 or 6 months, you know, someone else is going to come and replace you. And that was something that was always in Eddie's mind, you know, I was like, I can't stop now.
King, I think Eddie Guerrero is seriously hurt.
But he still wanted to wrestle. That's what he does. That's what he did. That's who he was. And there was also a lot of, I mean, let's be honest, we're all adults here. We all did the same shit. There's a lot of drinking. There's a lot of drugs.
But the more that Eddie was trying to hide his injuries with the drugs and the alcohol, it was just getting into a downward spiral.
You know, I saw Chris several different times and make sure that Eddie was tucked in bed okay, you know, and put on his side so he wouldn't throw up on himself. But then Eddie started getting DUIs, and crashing his car, and, you know, having overdose problems.
There was 3 ODs that Eddie did in our house. The first 2, I called the ambulance. And all they did was release him the next afternoon. They just sent him home. The 3rd time, I just let him lay there. I actually left and took the girls to school and just told God, if you're gonna take him, just take him now, because it was a bad place in my life.
A lot of wrestlers were dying from substance abuse issues, and in the back of your mind, always, you're like, man, is Eddie gonna be one of those? Is he gonna be a statistic?
Eddie showed up to work high one day where he was in bad shape, and I think that when they saw that and Eddie couldn't perform, that's when they said, we're gonna go ahead and let you go. He called me and said, well, I got fired. I finally was like, oh, well, thank God. I mean, because now the worst that could ever be imagined is happening.
They sent him to rehab, lost everything, and had to go from the depths of hell and work his way up the system again.
Little by little, he started changing his life to get clean.
After that, his wife came back, his family came back, his life came back.
And that's where Eddie got rehired from WWE, and things were great. He was in the best shape.
WrestleMania 20, the fans knew the history of Eddie and Chris. So the night in New York, it's the right time for both of these guys.
Me and Nancy were watching from the skybox. We were jittery and we were nervous and we were excited and we were stressed too, because we didn't know, if they were gonna win or what the outcome was.
Just happened. Wait a minute. The boot went flying. Boot came off. Look at this. Swap package. 1, 2, 3.
When Eddie won, it was pure joy.
Benoit going up to the top.
See my dad in the ring? He was my hero. I remember it like yesterday, man. Jumped up after he won the belt.
Nancy and I were crying and the girls were excited. And of course you see the confetti and all the fans just on their feet.
And then I got to see Eddie Guerrero go out there, best friend. What a moment. I'll never forget that.
And that's why that's one of the best moments in not just wrestling history, and I think TV history. It was the happy storybook ending of WrestleMania.
Thank God the office finally saw those guys for what they were.
It was my favorite time, my favorite match. I wish those two just retired right after that, to be honest with you.
I have never, ever seen a closer relationship or friendship between 2 wrestlers as I did between Chris and Eddie. It was an actual, real, no bullshit, out of the ring, caring relationship.
So there's a super show in Minneapolis. We got a flight to Minneapolis. It's a few hours, so Eddie's sitting there talking to me, and then he kind of passes out, sleeps, and I'm like, well, I didn't know that this had been happening to Eddie. He started talking to people and passed out in the middle of a sentence. So we get off the plane in Minneapolis, check into our hotel that we always go to, and we had seen Chris in the lobby also. Say, I'll see you down in the morning. Okay. 7 o'clock, and we're gonna go work out. It's set. 3 of us together, this is the way it was. Eddie goes to his room, I go to my room. Next morning, I get a call about 5:30. It's the front desk. Something's wrong with your uncle. Something's wrong with my uncle. So I get a knock on my door, security guard, and he's taking me into Eddie's room. I go, what's going on? He goes, well, your uncle didn't answer his wake-up call. So we came to his room and knocked, no answer. With the latch on, that means someone's in here. So they cut the latch off. I walk in and I look in the bathroom and I see Eddie face down. He's in his underwear, his toothbrush was in his hand. I grab him, I kind of try to shake him, and he's moving, and I hear him gurgling, like, and I'm like, Eddie, wiping his face, and he's like, he's still there, man, and we're trying, and then all of a sudden, he's in my arms, and he's not there anymore. He passed in my arms, like literally. Hold on. I haven't been to this moment in a long time. Then I get a call from Chris, and Chris goes, "Hey man, I'm downstairs, where are you? Hey man, are you sitting down?" He goes, "Yeah." And I go, "Eddie passed away this morning." And all you hear is, from a guy with no emotion whatsoever, you hear a wail. Just this wail from deep down, like a heartbreak. If you've ever heard one, this was a heartbreaking.
Then Vince called me, and he said, "He goes, Vicky," and he's just crying. I'm just like, I go, "Is it true? Eddie's passed away." He said, "I'm sorry."
Chris went over there and kind of knelt down and just Eddie on the forehead. I went over there and, kind of like the same thing. And it was hard. I mean, here's your buddy that you've been with for 8-10 years, every day pretty much.
And there wasn't really any sign that obviously he had relapsed.
He didn't relapse. The verdict was heart disease at 38.
I remember the day that my sister called me hysterical. I couldn't even understand her. You need to take some breaths and you need to tell me what's going on. She couldn't even get the words out. And when she told me, I burst into tears. And I thought about the kids, and Vicky really, just a flash in my head. And then my next thought was, oh my God, Chris.
Eddie Guerrero has passed away.
The tribute the WWE did couldn't have been any better. Yeah, the whole stage was filled with everyone from backstage. But all I can remember was Chris. He was just crying.
I only know that I love you. I miss you.
One by one, they took different talent that wanted to talk about Eddie, Eddie's passing, Eddie's life. And Chris did it, which is probably really difficult to do. Chris had a hard time getting through it.
I want to thank you from my heart and tell you that I love you and I'll never forget you. And I will see each other again. I love you, Eddie.
I believe it was very hard for him, I even cried after for him.
Funerals are never good, but Eddie's funeral was very hard. When I saw Benoit, he came and gave me a hug, but it was like the most desperate, saddest, I'm hanging on for dear life hug that you could ever get. Sobbing, deep, hitching sobs, and leaving literally a patch of wetness on the shoulder of my suit that soaked through to the shirt, went through the jacket and the shirt of tears.
I'd never seen Chris show emotion before. Of course it affected all of us, but I just think it affected Chris just like so much more. It affected Chris like a spouse or something.
When Eddie passed away, not only did it end Chris and Eddie's relationship, in a lot of ways it kind of ended mine with him too. I think he just became more and more of a hermit and didn't want to see people that he knew. I remember seeing him at Eddie's funeral, and the WWE guys had to leave right after the funeral to fly to Europe. You have Chris who has this horrible damage done to him, where he's crying, sobbing, the lowest point of his life, and as soon as the funeral's done, he goes on a plane and flies to Europe to wrestle. I didn't get that. I thought if there's ever a time to take some time off, or to give someone some time off, I think Chris needed to be away from stuff for a while, but I think he just continued on because he didn't know what else to do. He didn't handle it well. Let me just say it like that.
I was in bed like for the first week after we buried Eddie, and Nancy was the first one at the house. And she helped me with everything. I mean, she was the one who was making sure that the kids were fed. And finally, she just like walked in my room and she's like, enough. She goes, enough. Get up and shower. Get up because you have 2 girls that still love you and they need you. And I didn't want to do anything. And she threw me in the shower. She got the girls dressed and she goes, we're going to lunch. She was my angel in so many ways.
She just immediately went into planning mode. I'm gonna help with this and I'm gonna do that. And I mean, that was her knee-jerk reaction to grief and heartache. But Chris locked down.
And Nancy stayed with me for a month after Eddie passed away. And Chris would come in when they were off, and I would find Chris on Eddie's side of his bed. And Chris would just be laying there crying, holding Eddie's pillow. Eddie had a beautiful gym upstairs, and I would go upstairs and the girls would come down and they would say, Mom, Chris is crying again. And I would go to the gym and Chris would just be sitting on the bench just crying. He goes, I'm lost without Eddie being here. To see him just crying in my arms, it was very emotional. Here's this big, strong man who is tough and quiet and strong. He broke my heart. You know, but then you see Chris, you know, around the other wrestlers or in a meeting, and he had his face on. So professional, like you wouldn't even think that anything was bothering him. But Chris was getting more and more distant, where he was not being seen as much backstage, you know, where I couldn't find him. Like Nancy would call me and be like, how's Chris doing today? And I said, well, I haven't seen him.
She talked to me about it several times. She was like, there's something going on, and I don't know what it is. You gotta tell me if you notice something. And I was like, yeah, there's something up. He just seemed different. He was talking more about other wrestlers that had had children kidnapped and fans that went sideways and were violent. He used to take different cars and different ways to the gym that we had been going to for years. It was super random. He just didn't want to be places and be seen. There was a level of paranoia we had never, ever seen before.
Nancy started getting really worried. She's like, I'm really worried for Chris. This is really affecting him in so many ways. He was just sad all the time and depressed. He was impatient. There was a lot of fighting going on for reasons that she didn't understand why he would be upset. And she would just be like, life is just really hard right now. Like, Chris is just irritable and he doesn't want to talk to me. He's mad all the time. You know, he was just mad at life in general.
There were a few months where he completely closed off, not really even talking to Nancy, not really talking to anyone. So we got Chris a journal so that he could write to Eddie. I think that after we got him that journal is when he started opening up a little bit more, because writing to him, he started feeling like maybe Eddie was with him in spirit or in heart by just being able to talk to him every day.
Was there any point when Nancy wanted Chris to maybe step away from wrestling at all?
That last year, she didn't think that it was healthy physically or mentally for him to be on the road and doing so much work in the same places that he and his best friend used to be and do things together.
I remember talking to him, and he's like, every building I go to, all I can do is think of Eddie. Okay, we're in Kansas City. Last time I was here, Eddie was here. And now we're in New Mexico. Last time I was here, Eddie was here. I think all of those things were kind of signs that something really serious was going on with him.
He was so grief-stricken on a monumental level that she thought that staying in the company and staying in the business was going to eventually harm his well-being.
It's Saturday night. We're gonna go into Laredo, Texas. We're doing the Texas Loop. I get to Laredo, and Chris, myself, and Scott Armstrong are gonna ride together. And then later I get a call from Chris, and he goes, oh man, I'm not gonna make it. I go, what's wrong? He goes, Daniel and Nancy have food poisoning, and I'm just trying to take care of them. And I'm like, oh man, are you good? You all right? And he's like, yeah, I'm okay. I said, well, tomorrow we're in Houston for the pay-per-view. So he goes, okay, great. I said, okay, man. And he goes, Chavo. I go, yeah? And he goes, I love you. And I'm like, okay, brother, I love you too, man. That was weird. And I go, are you okay? He's like, yeah, I'm okay, man. I'm just really tired. And I said, okay, man. Okay, well, you can call me if you need to get any problem. Okay, well, I will. So then, that's it. About 5:30 in the morning, I get a text, and it was from Chris's phone. And it said, the dogs are in the enclosed pool area, and the back door is open. So I'm just half asleep, and I see this text, and I'm like, the heck is that? All of a sudden, 30 seconds later, I get another text from Nancy's phone, and it says the exact same thing. I was like, what? That's weird. I get another text right afterwards. It tells me his physical address. What is that? So I disregarded, thinking I'm picking Chris up in 3 hours at the airport. So then, I meet Scott downstairs. We go get breakfast, and I talk to him. I go, hey, man, did you get a weird text from Chris? And he goes, yeah, I did. I said, what did it say? And he said the exact same thing. We drive to Corpus Christi for the next show. Still no word from Chris. So the head of talent relations, Johnny Ace, asked me, hey, Chavo, have you heard from Chris? And I say, no. I said, but look, Johnny, and I bring up my phone and I show him. These are the texts that I got from Chris yesterday. And Johnny, in his raspy voice, is like, Chavo, why didn't you show us these yesterday? And I'm like, look, man, we were covering for Chris. We didn't know where he was. You didn't know where he was.
The office starting to get concerned because it was getting to be like 1, 2, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So Vince McMahon has sent a wellness check to his house.
My name is Dennis Fagan. I run the security for World Wrestling, and one of our wrestlers that lives down there is missing. We need a welfare check done.
And what's his name?
Chris Benoit. It's spelled Benoit.
Okay, and he's a wrestler?
So Vince McMahon calls a meeting at the ring.
Dean Malenko's sitting next to me. I just had this really bad feeling. Dean's like, there's something wrong. Something is not right.
That's when Vince McMahon stands up at the ring and says, we've just got word that Chris Benoit, Nancy, and Daniel have all passed away. And the gasps, of course, around the ring.
I remember Vicky, because she just let out this hurling scream.
I freaked out and I started crying, and Dean kind of stood up and he grabbed my hand and he took me off to the back.
So then Vince is backstage and I walk up to Vince and I said, what happened? What happened? And I'm a little frantic. And he says, they're gone. I said, what do you mean they're gone? And he hugs me super tight. And my head's on his shoulder, like crying to Vince, like, no, like, what happened? I don't understand. Nobody understood because no one knew the details yet.
I didn't know what was going on, but I'd heard enough to know that something's not right. If you would have lined up 100 people against the wall and said, name one that's gonna kill his family, how can this be? Like, how could he have done this? He fooled us all.
I went from just being a regular welfare check. Okay, we got something more serious here.
And I came out of the theater and I turned my phone on and I had like 22 missed calls from my parents.
The cop told me that they all passed away over the weekend.
You didn't want to believe it. Can't believe it. Can't be true. But it was.
The act of what he did is unthinkable, unforgivable.
Of the ring event, the company producer decided to reignite the famous rivalry using a relatively new and terrifying match concept. Hell in a Cell. Historically, the rules of a standard steel cage match dictated that a competitor could win by either climbing over the top of the fencing or walking out to the designated door. The origin of the Hell in a Cell concept involved placing a solid roof on top of the structure, ensuring that both competitors were locked inside, with the ominous promise that only one man would be able to walk out. The very first Hell in a Cell match had taken place between The Undertaker and Shawn Michaels, and it was universally hailed as a masterpiece, a critical mile marker in the evolution of the industry. Many analysts still consider the Michaels and Undertaker bout to be the technically superior match. When Foley watched that initial match, he was left completely open-jawed. He analyzed their athletic movements and concluded that he was physically incapable of replicating the athletic agility that Michaels and the Undertaker possessed. Knowing that he was scheduled to step into that same structure with the Undertaker 9 months later, Foley sought advice from his mentor, Terry Funk. According to their conversations, Funk jokingly suggested that it would be incredibly amusing if they started the match standing directly on top of the massive steel roof, and then Foley was violently thrown off the edge. While Funk intended the comment as dark humor, Foley processed the concept seriously. He stopped laughing, looked at Funk, and stated his genuine belief that his body could survive the fall. The psychological seed was planted. Foley could not extract the dangerous idea from his mind. He strategically pitched the concept of being thrown off the cell to The Undertaker and Vince McMahon during a casual conversation, operating under the guise of an excellent sales pitch. According to backstage accounts, The Undertaker was highly reluctant and generally opposed to the idea of throwing his colleague off a towering structure. However, Foley remained absolutely dead set on executing the stunt. Eventually, he managed to convince the necessary parties to agree to the plan. At this stage in his life, Foley was not viewing this match as the grand second act of a long career. According to his personal reflections, he was simply viewing it as a desperate measure to keep his head above water in a ruthlessly competitive industry. He genuinely believed that whenever the specific run with the company concluded, his career as a professional wrestler would be permanently over. When asked if the management knew exactly what Foley had planned, sources confirmed that Foley had indeed communicated the major high spots, assuring everyone involved that he possessed the spatial awareness to execute the fall safely. Those who worked closely with him trusted his judgment, operating under the belief that if Foley could visualize the stunt in his mind, his body could physically achieve it. The atmosphere in the Pittsburgh Civic Arena was electric and deeply tense. The audience knew they were about to witness only the second hell in a cell match in history. The commentators vividly remember the immense pressure that must have been crushing Mick Foley's shoulders as he made his long walk down the entrance aisle toward the ring. He was fully aware that the audience would inevitably compare his performance to the legendary bout between Shawn Michaels and The Undertaker. He knew his physical limitations, recognizing that he lacked the nimble agility of his peers. Backstage, the production team was intensely focused. Jimmy Corderas, who was operating as a referee and member of the ring crew, was stationed directly behind the curtain. Gerald Briscoe, acting as a lead producer, was seated in what they referred to as the pilot seat, surrounded by 10 separate television monitors, preparing to direct the chaotic broadcast. Absolutely no one, from the executives to the fans, knew exactly what to anticipate. It is widely agreed that no human mind could have accurately predicted the terrifying sequence of events that was about to unfold. At the commentary desk, Jim Ross and Jerry Lawler were kept completely in the dark, experiencing the events with the same pure shock as the fans watching from their living rooms. Foley's calculated strategy was to initiate the contest in a manner that had never been attempted in the history of the sport. As his entrance music echoed through the arena, instead of stepping through the cell door, Foley began to climb the exterior wall of the structure. The facial expressions of the fans instantly transformed into pure shock. The commentators openly questioned his logic, suggesting on the live broadcast that the man was completely unhinged and in desperate need of psychiatric therapy. Foley had confidently assured Vince McMahon and The Undertaker that he was comfortable navigating the top of the cell. However, according to his later confessions, that was a complete fabrication. When he actually reached the summit of the structure, staring down into the darkness of the arena, he was legitimately terrified, battling severe fear heights. As The Undertaker's ominous music began to play and the giant began his own ascent, Foley internally panicked, desperately trying to calculate a way to gracefully climb back down to the floor without entirely ruining his professional reputation. The match officially commenced on the roof. The visual alone created an immediate sense of psychological dread among the audience. The architecture of the cage had not been designed to support the combined weight of two massive athletes. The top section of the metal mesh was secured merely by plastic zip ties. With nearly 600 pounds of human mass moving aggressively across the surface, the structural integrity instantly began to fail. With every single step, the metal mesh buckled and sagged downward by roughly a full foot. The piercing sound of the plastic zip ties snapping and springing off the metal echoed to the microphones. When the officials heard the structural supports failing, a wave of genuine panic swept through the production area. In the ring, Foley attempted to execute a suplex maneuver on top of the failing mesh. The Undertaker, keenly aware of the imminent structural collapse, instantly blocked the move, realizing there was a very high mathematical probability that they would both crash straight through the ceiling to the floor below. The two men began trading heavy physical blows, slowly migrating toward the very edge of the towering structure, positioning themselves directly above the Spanish announcer's broadcast table. Watching from ringside, Jim Ross firmly believed that despite the chaotic nature of the performers, there was absolutely no logical way Foley would actually take a tumble off the top of the cage. The variables were too unpredictable, and the margin for error was virtually non-existent. Looking down from his precarious vantage point, Foley viewed the announce table below not as a safe landing pad, but as a terrifyingly small, fragile dollhouse. He did not know how the physics of the fall would work out, and he was filled with intense regret. As they teetered on the edge, the terrifying inevitability of the moment washed over the arena. Then it happened. A 300-pound human being was violently flung through the air from a height of approximately 20 feet, plummeting at a terrifying velocity directly toward the broadcast personnel. According to Foley, the experience of falling defied the normal perception of time. It simultaneously felt as though it was happening in extreme slow motion, while also passing by in the mere blink of an eye. The physical impact was catastrophic. The deafening sound of human bone and flesh obliterating the wooden table sent a shockwave of terror through the building. The commentators lost their professional composure, shouting in pure disbelief. Backstage, the reaction was explosive. The locker room erupted in genuine, horrifying concern. Veteran wrestlers and producers described the visual as being identical to witnessing a fatal automobile accident. Many seasoned professionals staring at the monitors honestly believed they had just watched a man die on live television. The sheer violence of a human body stopping completely dead in its tracks upon impacting the floor was profoundly disturbing. In an industry built on elaborate stunts and controlled risks, absolutely nobody had ever attempted something of this magnitude. The general consensus behind the curtain was that the match was immediately over. There was no physiological way a human being could survive that impact and return to their feet. In the arena, there was an audible gasp that swept through the 16,000 fans, a collective cry of absolute horror. Families watching at home were forced to comfort their traumatized children, desperately attempting to reassure them that the violence was merely special effects. Even as the parents themselves internally panicked at the very real possibility of a tragedy. The brutal reality of the stunt was undeniable. If The Undertaker had thrown him just a fraction of an inch too far, or a fraction of an inch too short, Foley would have missed the table entirely, plummeting from that massive height directly onto the unforgiving concrete floor, or worse, crushing the spectators seated in the front row. While his body lay motionless in the wreckage, Foley was shielded from the immediate agony by a massive surge of pure adrenaline. In his mind, he had successfully executed a highly ambitious, deeply dangerous goal. From a technical standpoint, the trajectory through the table was flawlessly executed. In the critical milliseconds while suspended in mid-air, he possessed the incredible spatial awareness to rotate his body, ensuring he landed completely flat across the surface of the desk, utilizing the braking wood to cushion the devastating impact and ultimately save his own life. In the production truck, the directors immediately shifted into a cold, clinical business mode, rapidly coordinating camera angles to capture the replays of the horrifying spectacle. At ringside, Hugo Savinovic, the Spanish commentator, had narrowly escaped being crushed by diving out his chair mere seconds before impact. He was left deeply traumatized, standing over the broken body of his friend, agonizing over the unwritten rule of the industry that strictly forbade him from interfering with the performance. The scene at ringside was absolute pandemonium. The fans stared in stunned silence at the shattered performer lying motionless at their feet. Medical attendants, referees, and company officials frantically swarmed the area. Terry Funk was the first veteran to reach the wreckage, desperately checking to see if his friend was still conscious. The logistical nightmare compounded when the medical team realized they could not navigate the emergency gurney to the wreckage because the massive steel cell was blocking the path. The production crew was forced to mechanically raise the entire steel structure toward the ceiling, with the Undertaker still ominously standing on the roof, simply to allow the medical personnel access to the victim. Backstage, Dr. Francois Petit, the chief medical officer for the World Wrestling Federation, was summoned with extreme urgency. Dr. Petit was a highly unique individual, described by colleagues as a martial arts expert and a master of skeletal manipulation, a man who possessed a reputation for being able to violently snap injured athletes back into functional alignment. When he received a frantic call that Foley had fallen from the roof, he rushed to the arena floor. Upon examining the fallen performer, the doctor observed that Foley had landed terribly on his back, simultaneously aggravating a severely dislocated shoulder. Foley was strapped securely to the medical gurney. The situation was completely authentic. They were actively preparing to transport him to the nearest trauma center. The audience, the commentators, and the executives all believed the horrific spectacle had reached its conclusion. However, as they began to wheel the gurney up the entrance aisle, the complex psychology of Mick Foley took control once again. Through the haze of pain and adrenaline, Foley analyzed the crowd's reaction. He realized that the longer he remained on the screen, the more deeply the audience became emotionally invested in his survival. Despite the desperate pleas from the medical staff, the referees, and his close friends screaming at him to stay down, Foley forced himself off the gurney. He was heavily battered, limping, and disoriented, yet he began to march back toward the ring. The locker room watched the monitors in a state of absolute disbelief. Fellow professionals questioned his sanity, labeling him the most reckless individual in the history of the business. The commentators voiced their pure shock, unable to comprehend the physiological mechanics, allowing him to remain upright. Foley himself later admitted that he had absolutely no rational idea how he was going to survive the remainder of the performance. But he had made a sacred pledge to deliver a legendary match, and he was stubbornly determined to fulfill that promise. Analysts point to this specific moment, the agonizing climb off the stretcher and the march back to the cage, as the exact instance that transformed him from a popular character into an immortal industry legend. While the backstage area descended into chaotic concern, some veteran producers remained exactly where they were, guided by a chilling intuition that the violence was far from over. From a purely narrative perspective, Foley's return to the structure successfully created another unforgettable moment, escalating the dramatic tension to unprecedented heights. However, as industry veterans often warn, a performer can easily storyline themselves directly into a hospital bed. The planned sequence of events called for Foley to return to the roof of the cell. According to the original script agreed upon by the performers, The Undertaker was supposed to execute a chokeslam maneuver, which was designed to safely dent the metal mesh, creating a powerful visual of Foley being violently stuffed down into the sagging roof. That was the intended plan. The reality of what occurred next was a complete and catastrophic mechanical failure. The moment The Undertaker drove Foley into the roof, the metal mesh did not simply sag. The zip ties failed entirely, and the panel completely gave way. Foley plummeted to the ceiling, falling blindly into the center of the ring. This was fundamentally different from the first fall. This was not a calculated stunt. This was a terrifying accident. Backstage, the reaction escalated from concern to absolute panic. Producers screamed at the monitors. executives desperately attempted to establish radio contact with the ringside officials. Finding the communication lines jammed by the sheer chaos of the moment, families watching at home were horrified, completely unable to explain to their children the difference between a scripted performance and the very real devastation unfolding on screen. Foley hit the ring mat with catastrophic force. As wrestling veterans constantly remind the public, the ring mat is not a soft cushion. It is a thinly padded surface stretched over heavy wood and solid steel beams. The impact is frequently compared to falling directly onto cement. The terror of the moment was compounded by a horrific variable, a solid steel folding chair, which had been resting on the roof of the cell, plummeted to the opening directly behind Foley. As he slammed into the mat, the heavy steel chair crashed violently down, striking him directly in the face. The medical consensus is that this specific impact could have easily resulted in a fatal outcome. When his wife and family saw the chair strike his face, they legitimately believed they had just witnessed his death. Colette Foley was overwhelmed by a mixture of deep trauma and furious anger, operating under mistaken belief that her husband had betrayed her trust by secretly planning a second, even more dangerous fall without her knowledge. For the very first time in his extensive and violent career, Mick Foley was legitimately knocked unconscious. A profound silence fell over the ring as medical personnel, including Dr. Petit and Terry Funk, flooded the cage. The professionals surrounding his motionless body genuinely feared the absolute worst. The Undertaker, looking down from the broken roof, locked eyes with the officials, his expression conveying that the violence had to end. He instructed Terry Funk to check if Foley was still breathing. For 42 agonizing seconds, Foley was completely lost to the darkness. In order to divert the television cameras away from the medical emergency, Terry Funk improvised a physical altercation with The Undertaker, selflessly taking a brutal beating to buy the medical team precious seconds to evaluate Foley's condition. According to modern athletic commission standards, the match should have been immediately terminated. However, the culture of the industry during that era dictated that matches were rarely stopped. Performers simply improvised to buy time. When Foley finally regained consciousness, his vision was heavily blurred. The first image his eyes focused on was the shoes worn by Terry Funk. In that disoriented state, his deeply ingrained professional instincts took over. He realized he was in the middle of a live broadcast, and he stubbornly forced himself to stand. The commentators were completely astounded by his resilience. However, as medical professionals now emphasize, allowing a performer who has just suffered a severe traumatic brain injury to simply stand up and continue a physical combat performance is a truly reckless and dangerous decision. Despite the severe concussion, Foley's mind immediately defaulted to television production. As the fog in his brain began to clear, he realized it sustained a massive, gaping wound completely through his lower lip. In a moment of macabre brilliance, he intentionally manipulated his tongue, pushing it directly through the open wound in his face. Turning toward the camera to deliver a haunting, blood-soaked smile. Adding to the grotesque visual, the impact of the steel chair had violently knocked out one of his teeth. Due to the heavy, concussive breathing, the tooth had somehow been inhaled, traveling up through his throat and violently lodging itself inside his nasal passage, becoming visibly stuck in his nostril. The image of the smiling, bleeding, broken man, with a human tooth protruding from his nose, remains one of the most chilling and iconic visuals in television history. The concern etched on the faces of the officials in the ring was not acting. The Undertaker looked deeply into Foley's eyes and immediately recognized that the man was severely compromised. Yet, Foley refused to submit. In his concussed state, his only coherent thought was to proceed to the next planned phase of the match, the introduction of thousands of sharp metal thumbtacks. Foley demanded that the thumbtacks be scattered across the mat, demonstrating an absolute disregard for his own safety. He purposely allowed himself to be violently thrown into the bed of spikes, actively rolling his body across the mat to ensure as many metal tacks as possible embedded themselves deep into his flesh. According to sports psychologists, when the human body is flooded with that level of adrenaline and trauma, The perception of pain alters. The athlete no longer merely feels the pain. They become an active participant in it, pushing the limits of human endurance far beyond rational comprehension. Finally, after 17 grueling minutes, the ordeal concluded with The Undertaker securing the victory. The 16,000 fans in Pittsburgh had witnessed a spectacle that defied logic. When the medical stretchers were brought out for the second time, Foley stubbornly waved them away, choosing to walk up the ramp under his own power, a decision that caused the crowd to erupt in absolute adulation. The audience fundamentally understood that the suffering they had just witnessed was completely authentic. Foley had successfully utilized his own physical destruction to forge an unbreakable, emotional bond with the fans, securing their unwavering loyalty. Behind the curtain, the atmosphere was a heavy mixture of relief and severe reprimand. Vince McMahon approached Foley directly, expressing deep gratitude for the sacrifices made for the company, but firmly demanding a promise that Foley would never attempt anything of that magnitude ever again. Foley's disorientation was so profound that, while the medical staff was actively using pliers to forcefully pluck dozens of metal thumbtacks from his skin, he genuinely asked The Undertaker if they had remembered to perform the thumbtack sequence during the match. The physical consequences were severe. Foley required 15 stitches to close the hole below his lip. He lost 2 teeth, suffered a dislocated jaw, a dislocated shoulder, and a heavily bruised kidney that plagued him for 6 weeks. Astonishingly, medical records from the era suggest he was not formally treated for the massive concussion he undoubtedly sustained. However, the professional payoff was undeniable. The match served as the ultimate catalyst for a massive career renaissance. Within 6 months of the event, the man whom Vince McMahon had initially deemed completely unmarketable was crowned the World Wrestling Federation champion. However, this unprecedented success created a dangerous psychological trap. The overwhelming reaction of the crowds, the massive surge of adrenaline, and the intoxicating rush of fame fueled an addiction to extreme risk. The bar for violence had been set impossibly high, and Foley felt a crushing obligation to continually live up to the moniker of the hardcore legend, against the explicit warnings of executives who cautioned him that the continuous accumulation of trauma would eventually catch up with his body. Foley refused to slow down. He understood the risks, but he stubbornly disagreed with the timeline of his own physical deterioration. Just 7 months after the events of Hell in a Cell, Foley pushed his physical limits once again in a brutal, heavily criticized showdown against The Rock, known as the I Quit match. According to the pre-match agreements, there was a specific directive that the bout would not be stopped due to excessive blood loss. Backstage producers had explicitly warned Foley that the planned violence was a horrible idea, but Foley was completely committed to executing his vision. The match quickly devolved into a deeply uncomfortable display of brutality. Foley instructed The Rock to hit him with absolute, unmitigated force. During the climax of the bout, Foley's hands were tightly bound by steel police handcuffs, leaving his head completely unprotected. The original plan dictated that Foley would absorb 5 unprotected strikes to the skull with a solid steel chair. Instead, the sequence horribly escalated, and Foley absorbed 11 devastating, completely unprotected headshots. The footage of this event is difficult to watch, specifically because it cuts to the audience, revealing Foley's wife and young children seated in the front row, sobbing in pure terror. His children were not old enough to differentiate between the scripted narrative and the very real. Violence inflicting brain damage upon their father. The trauma inflicted upon his family. That evening remains a deeply sensitive subject. Noelle Foley has stated that she possesses absolutely no childhood memories of her father wrestling. A psychological defense mechanism developed to block out the severe trauma of witnessing his brutal beatings. Medical professionals have stated clearly that receiving 11 unprotected blows to the skull with a steel weapon could easily result in death for a normal human being. Foley's justification for the extreme violence was rooted in his desire to continuously over-deliver for the paying audience. He fully understood that his chosen style would result in severe long-term discomfort. He has admitted that on countless occasions, He purposely chose to execute maneuvers in the most painful manner possible simply because he believed it looked more authentic on television. Despite numerous medical professionals explicitly warning him that continuing his career would inevitably lead to severe physical crippling, Foley refused to step away. He was deeply entrenched in the belief that he always had one great match left in him, constantly attempting to delay the inevitable breakdown of his body. The documented evidence of his physical decline during this period is alarming. Colleagues recall severe instances of cognitive failure, including moments where he would drive around his own neighborhood, completely unable to remember the location of his own home. He was suffering from a continuous compounding of concussions. Eventually, a neurological specialist evaluated Foley outside of the company's purview. The doctor's assessment was blunt and chilling, warning Foley that while he could theoretically search the country for a doctor willing to clear him, the absolute medical truth was that he should never step foot inside a wrestling ring again. The brutal reality of pushing the absolute limits of human endurance is that a heavy price is eventually demanded, and according to those closest to him, Foley is currently paying that exact price. During the era of these extreme matches, the long-term physiological effects of concussions were not widely understood or discussed within the industry. Medical science now equates the impact of a standard wrestling bump to the physical forces experienced during a 25-mile-per-hour automobile accident. The cumulative damage of thousands of these impacts over a decades-long career is unimaginable. Modern science has identified chronic traumatic encephalopathy, a terrifying degenerative brain disease caused by repetitive brain trauma, as a significant threat to performers from that era. The fear of cognitive decline is a constant, looming shadow over the Foley family. They live with the terrifying uncertainty of not knowing how his neurological health will degrade in 10 or 20 years. Despite the overwhelming medical evidence and the terrifying reality of his physical deterioration, Foley's psychological need for connection and performance remains strong. He actively fights the cognitive decline by participating in spoken word tours across the globe, utilizing the stage as mental gymnastics to keep his mind sharp. The stimulation of a live audience, the echoes of the crowd chanting his name, provide a vital energy source that keeps him moving forward. He has openly stated that he chooses to appreciate the incredible life he has lived rather than succumbing to the paralyzing fear of the medical unknown. His family understands his complex psychology. They support his continued engagement with his legacy, while constantly reminding him not to push his luck any further. Foley acknowledges that he was, quite often, his own worst enemy inside the squared circle. He recognizes the fundamental absurdity of his profession. Men dressing up in wild costumes to engage in a fantasy form of combat that systematically destroys their physical health, all in a desperate bid to earn the acceptance and adoration of total strangers. For Mick Foley, the ultimate motivation was always a reaction. It was about witnessing the eyes of the audience light up in shock and awe. It was a profound, almost dangerous desire to present total authenticity. Driven by a deep-rooted psychological need to be loved, he willingly sacrificed his physical well-being, trading his long-term health for the deafening roar of the crowd. He acknowledges that this intense need for validation is simultaneously his greatest personal flaw, and the exact characteristic responsible for his monumental global success. While Mick Foley's career is filled with multiple championship reigns and extensive charitable work, his cultural identity is permanently fused to the events of Hell in a Cell. For many years, he harbored a deep resentment toward the match, frustrated that society seemingly reduced his entire life's work to a single evening of extreme violence. This internal conflict pushed him into a very dark psychological space, leaving him feeling as though, despite surviving the unimaginable, he had somehow accomplished nothing of true substance. The turning point in his perspective occurred during a quiet conversation with The Undertaker. Reflecting on the chaos of that night in 1998, The Undertaker looked at his legendary rival and stated a profound truth. The sheer magnitude of what they accomplished that night will outlive them both. This realization allowed Foley to finally embrace the legacy of the match. He accepted that creating immortal moments of awe is the absolute highest achievement a performer can attain. The profound emotional weight of this legacy was fully captured during a visit to the company's storage warehouse. While walking through the archives with his daughter, Foley unexpectedly encountered the original steel panels of the Hell in a Cell structure. Upon touching the cold metal, the man known as a hardcore legend completely broke down, crying in front of his child. For a man who built a career on masking pain, the tears revealed the immense, terrifying gravity of the memories attached to that steel mesh. It was a visceral reminder of how incredibly close he came to losing his life in the pursuit of entertainment. When analyzing the history of this industry, it is clear that there is no financial or professional reward substantial enough to logically justify the physical risks Mick Foley accepted. While society now possesses a much deeper understanding of traumatic brain injuries, Foley himself remains uncertain if he would have altered his violent trajectory even if he had possessed modern medical knowledge at the time. He viewed the professional wrestling ring not merely as an athletic contest, but as a blank canvas, allowing him to create a deeply surreal, sublime, and dangerous form of performance art. The physical bumps in the road were catastrophic, but the emotional connection he forged with the world remains unbroken. Because as the footage proves, on those specific nights when the chaos aligned perfectly, it resulted in one of the most powerful, undeniable emotional experiences in the world. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Tonight, we step back into the shadows of a defining era in sports entertainment. We are looking at a moment etched in time, a night that permanently altered the landscape of professional wrestling and redefined the boundaries of human endurance. We travel back to June 28, 1998. The event was the World Wrestling Federation's King of the Ring on pay-per-view. The match was The Undertaker versus Mankind inside the demonic structure known as Hell in a Cell. This match hits you like a physical blow to the consciousness. Even for those of us who have spent our lives documenting the triumphs and tragedies of this industry, this particular contest remains a stunning anomaly. We knew it was going to be intense. We knew it was going to be chaotic. But nobody, absolutely nobody, knew it was going to push the envelope until the envelope simply disintegrated over the edge. People often say that professional wrestling is predetermined, but as we will explore tonight, you cannot fake gravity. Many things in this business have frightened me over the years, but nothing frightened me quite as much as what we witnessed that night in Pittsburgh. What left fans completely stunned, and what continues to leave historians speechless, is the unrelenting punishment that Mick Foley endured until you watched it unfold with your own eyes. You simply would not believe that a human being could physically take this kind of abuse and survive. Make no mistake, this match was real. The pain radiating through the arena was real. The raw, unfiltered drama was as real as it gets. Looking back at the footage, you can hear the sheer panic. I remember watching it, screaming at the monitors, calling him an absolute idiot, pleading to the heavens, asking why he was doing this to himself. To understand the madness of Hell in a Cell, and to understand why its legacy persists as both an epic masterpiece and a chilling cautionary tale, we must first understand the mind of the man known as the hardcore legend. Mick Foley was a man who built his career on taking the path of most resistance. In this industry, we dodged several bullets that night. It remains a dangerously crazy work of art, but it forces every single one of us to ask one profound question. Was the ultimate sacrifice truly worth it? Every individual who steps into a wrestling ring is searching for something missing in their own life. According to Mick Foley himself, his childhood was defined by a desperate, overwhelming need to be liked. He faced relentless teasing in his youth, which created a void that only the roar of a crowd could fill. Foley once recounted a story from his sophomore year of college that perfectly encapsulates his psychological drive. He took a swig of red food coloring and performed a flying leap off a bed, crashing onto a stuffed dummy resting on a concrete floor. Upon impact, he spat the fake blood across the room. The girls watching screamed in horror, calling it the most disgusting thing they had ever seen. But in that horror, Foley found something intoxicating. He found power. He realized early on that if he could not force people to love him, he could certainly force them to be disgusted, shocked, and captivated by him. He simply needed a reaction. For many fans, the 1998 Hell in a Cell match serves as the perfect gateway into professional wrestling. It is often the first match shown to newcomers, eliciting sheer disbelief. But the reality is, not every match is like this. In fact, no match should ever be like this. However, for Mick Foley, brutality was a baseline. A standard Foley match involved immense suffering, from bleeding and barbed wire to being thrown into thumbtacks, to experiencing explosions from plastic explosives in a grueling death match to Japan. He took brutal falls on solid concrete. He put his body through an unfathomable amount of trauma. According to his daughter, Noelle Foley, her father thrived on hearing the crowd gasp in horror. Realism was Foley's ultimate tool, according to his own admissions. He did not believe he had performed well unless he physically struggled to walk back to his hotel room. He did not necessarily enjoy the agonizing pain, but he enjoyed his unique ability to absorb it and project it into a story that entertained the masses. Colette Foley, his wife of over 35 years, saw beyond the scars and the blood. She recognized his gentle nature, his terrible sense of humor, and his profound commitment to his craft. When that adrenaline began pumping, his sole objective was ensuring the audience went home talking about the show, completely disregarding his own physical well-being. This relentless drive birthed the persona of Cactus Jack. Cactus Jack was an uncontrollable force, a man who moved and fought with an unpredictable chaos that made audiences question his sanity. Legendary manager and producer Jim Cornette noted that Foley possessed an undeniable charisma and a brilliant grasp of in-ring psychology. Foley recognized that audiences were captivated by performers who appeared entirely out of control, men who seemed to be going completely off the script. Foley could take the fans on a psychological ride, forcing them to focus entirely on his unpredictable nature. In his early days, Foley's bedroom consisted of a mattress on the floor, accompanied by a small black and white television and a barely functioning video cassette recorder. He would spend up to 12 hours a day studying Japanese wrestling tapes. He was drawn to the visceral storytelling, recognizing that in those brutal matches, a competitor was not just fighting another man. They were fighting the environment itself. Foley naturally assumed his career would peak in Japan, where promoters were constantly searching for foreign talent to battle legends like Terry Funk. Funk, a master at making audiences suspend their disbelief, became a mentor to Foley. Together, they engaged in explosive, bloody encounters overseas. Foley would literally crawl on his hands and knees during these matches, viewing his own suffering as definitive proof that he was creating something special. Because of this extreme style, Foley never envisioned himself becoming a star in the World Wrestling Federation. During that era, the promotion was strictly targeted toward general audiences. It was heavily sanitized, and Foley's gritty, violent approach simply did not fit the corporate mold. Al Snow, a former superstar and Foley's closest traveling companion, noted that Vince McMahon initially had zero interest in hiring Foley. McMahon did not find Foley marketable or physically attractive. Jim Ross, who served as vice president of talent relations, had a passionately advocate for Foley. Ross recognized that the company desperately needed fresh, unpredictable challengers for their top star, The Undertaker. McMahon was obsessed with booking giant, towering men against The Undertaker, a strategy that often resulted in dull, uninspiring matches. Ross knew they needed a lunatic. According to backstage accounts, McMahon finally relented, slamming his hand on a table and agreeing to hire Foley under one strict condition: they had to cover his face. McMahon viewed Foley as a nobody, leading to the creation of the Mankind character. As Hall of Famer Gerald Briscoe recalled, the creative team was tasked with building a captivating persona around a concept that the owner fundamentally disliked. Yet, this bizarre masked character worked solely because of Mick Foley's complete dedication. Without his bizarre mannerisms, like pulling his own hair out, And without his deep emotional connection to the audience, the character would have failed miserably. The immediate challenge for management was keeping Foley from killing himself in the ring. He was willing to try absolutely anything to secure his spot. He and The Undertaker built a tremendous foundation, wrestling in 7 major pay-per-view events and 10 television matches across the globe. However, by the summer of 1998, Foley felt his character was losing momentum. He needed to do something drastic to revitalize his career and cement their legacy. This brings us to King of the Ring. The producers planned to reignite the rivalry using the newly developed Hell in a cell structure. The original concept, credited to Foley in a conversation with Vince McMahon, was simple yet terrifying. Put a roof on a traditional steel cage so that both men go in, but only one walks out. The inaugural Hell in a cell match featured Shawn Michaels and The Undertaker, establishing a nearly impossible standard of excellence. Foley watched that first match in awe, fully aware that he lacked the athletic agility to replicate what Michaels had done. Searching for inspiration, Foley asked Terry Funk for advice. Funk jokingly suggested that they should start the match on top of the cell roof, and that Foley should be thrown off. What started as a dark joke immediately became an obsession for Foley. He could not let the idea go. He casually pitched the incredibly dangerous stunt to The Undertaker and Vince McMahon. The Undertaker was extremely hesitant, not wanting to throw his colleague from such a perilous height. Foley, however, was dead set on the idea, viewing this monumental risk not as the second act of his career, but as a desperate bid to keep his head above water. He genuinely believed his career was nearing its end. The Undertaker eventually trusted Foley's vision, operating under the assumption that if Foley believed he could survive the fall, he would. As the event approached, commentators Jim Ross and Jerry Lawler hyped the immense stakes, noting that the loser might bypass the hospital and head straight to the morgue. They had no idea how prophetic those words would feel just minutes later. On that fateful Sunday night, 16,000 fans packed the Pittsburgh Civic Arena. Referee Jimmy Corderas, a member of the ring crew, watched from the backstage monitors alongside Gerald Briscoe. No one in the building, neither the fans nor the broadcast team, knew exactly what was about to transpire. Mankind's music hit, and instead of entering the cage, Foley began scaling the 20-foot steel structure. There was a palpable shock in the arena. Foley later admitted that he had never actually been on top of the cell before that moment. Despite assuring management he was comfortable with heights, he was internally terrified. The Undertaker made his entrance, and the match officially began not on the canvas, but on the unforgiving mesh ceiling. The structural integrity of the cell was immediately compromised. The roof was secured only by standard zip ties, completely unequipped to handle 600 pounds of human weight. With every step, the mesh sank noticeably. On commentary, the horror was evident as the zip ties began audibly snapping. Foley attempted a maneuver, but The Undertaker quickly countered, moving them closer to the edge. Looking down at the incredibly small Spanish announce table, Foley realized his margin for error was virtually non-existent. Then, in a moment that stopped time, The Undertaker grabbed Mankind and hurled his 300-pound body off the top of the cage. He plummeted 20 feet, crashing violently through the wooden table. The sound of the impact was sickening. Backstage, the locker room erupted in genuine terror. It was not a wrestling move. It looked like a catastrophic car accident. Jim Ross screamed his legendary call on the broadcast, convinced that they had just witnessed a fatal tragedy. In the arena, there was an audible collective gasp. Colette Foley, watching at home with her young children, desperately tried to soothe them by claiming it was fake, even as her own mind spiraled into panic. It was a fall of absolute precision. Had The Undertaker thrown him a few inches too far or too short, Foley would have hit raw concrete. In midair, Foley managed to rotate his body, taking the impact flat on his back to maximize the cushion of the table. Medical personnel, including Dr. Francois Petit, scrambled to the wreckage. Terry Funk was the first to reach Foley, checking to see if he was even conscious. The emergency medical technicians brought a gurney to ringside, but would not fit through the aisle, forcing him to raise the enormous cell structure. Foley was strapped to the board. The match appeared to be completely over. But as he was being wheeled away, Foley realized the magnitude of the moment. The audience was entirely silent, completely invested in survival. Fueled by adrenaline and a terrifying lack of self-preservation, Foley rolled off the gurney. Ignoring the desperate pleas of medical staff and officials, he began climbing the cell again. The crowd erupted, witnessing a man refusing to stay down. Backstage, officials knew something else was planned, but they had no idea how catastrophic the next chapter would be. The planned sequence called for The Undertaker to chokeslam Foley onto the mesh, causing the cage to safely sag. But the cell gave way completely. Foley plummeted straight through the roof, plummeting toward the solid ring canvas below. This was not planned. This was an unmitigated disaster. The ring mat is essentially a thin layer of padding over solid wood and steel beams. It is like hitting cement. To make matters worse, a heavy steel folding chair fell for the opening directly behind him, smashing into Foley's face upon impact. This second fall legitimately knocked Foley unconscious for the first time in his entire career. Panic ensued. The Undertaker stared down to the broken roof, later admitting he genuinely believed Foley might be dead. Terry Funk and medical staff flooded the ring. Funk brilliantly bought time, engaging the Undertaker in a brief scuffle to draw the cameras away from the motionless Foley. For 42 agonizing seconds, Foley was completely blacked out. By all modern medical standards, the match should have been stopped immediately. But in 1998, matches were rarely stopped for injury. Officials merely bought time for the athletes to recover. When Foley finally regained consciousness, his first sight was Terry Funk's shoes. In a state of profound concussion, Foley insisted on finishing the match. As he sat in the corner, television cameras captured a horrific image. Foley had a massive wound under his lip, and a dislodged tooth was visibly protruding from his nostril. Medical staff later theorized a chair impact knocked the tooth down his throat, and he coughed it upward into his nasal passage. Foley, ever the showman, intentionally stuck his tongue through his torn lip and smiled for the cameras. The match continued into its final, agonizing act. Foley reached under the ring and poured thousands of metal thumbtacks onto the canvas. Despite his severe injuries, Foley willingly took a choke slam directly into the bed of tacks, ensuring his body was completely covered in the piercing metal. After 17 grueling minutes, The Undertaker finally secured the victory. The Pittsburgh crowd stood in sheer awe. When the medical staff brought the stretcher back out, Foley waved it off, choosing to walk out under his own power to a thunderous, emotional ovation. The fans knew they had witnessed a man sacrifice his own body for their entertainment. That level of undeniable reality cemented Foley's legacy forever. However, the collateral damage behind the curtain was immense. Colette Foley waited agonizing hours for a phone call, her anxiety morphing into intense anger. When Foley finally called, she screamed that their children believed he was dead. The trust she held in his judgment was permanently shattered. Backstage, Vince McMahon approached Foley, thanked him for his profound contribution to the company, and strictly demanded he never do anything like that again. The physical toll was catastrophic. Foley suffered a dislocated jaw, a dislocated shoulder, a bruised kidney, 15 facial stitches, missing teeth, and multiple severe concussions. He required assistance just to undress and get into bed that night, yet within 6 months. This monumental display of toughness propelled Foley to the World Wrestling Federation Championship. The tragedy of the hardcore style is that the bar is constantly raised. Just 7 months later, Foley pushed his limits again in a brutal I Quit match against The Rock. The script called for Foley to take a series of unprotected chair shots to the head while handcuffed. The original plan was for 5 strikes, but the sequence spiraled out of control. Foley endured 11 vicious, unprotected blows to the skull. His wife and young children watched in horror from the front row. Noelle Foley, scarred by the memory, states she cannot bring herself to watch her father's matches, knowing the immense brain trauma those 11 chair shots inflicted. Years of prioritizing the audience's reaction over his own health left a dark shadow over Foley's retirement. Medical professionals explicitly warned him to stop wrestling, warning him of severe, long-term crippling effects. Despite the warnings of neurologists, Foley continued to wrestle, desperately chasing that final, perfect match. Today, the wrestling community grapples with the terrifying reality of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, a degenerative brain, disease caused by repetitive trauma. Foley's family lives in constant fear of what his neurological health will look like in 10, 20 years. Foley himself admits he has no clear way out of the physical debt he accrued. He relies on spoken word tours to keep his mind active, treating it as mental gymnastics to combat memory loss. For years, he harbored deep resentment toward the Hell in a cell match, feeling that his entire multifaceted career had been reduced to a single night of reckless violence. It sent him to a very dark psychological place. It was only a conversation with The Undertaker that brought him peace. The Undertaker reminded him that what they created that night in Pittsburgh will outlive them both. Foley eventually embraced his legacy. During a visit to the corporate warehouse with his daughter, Foley unexpectedly encountered the original Hell in a cell structure. Approaching the rusted steel, the legendary brawler broke down in tears. It was a profound realization of his own mortality, recognizing how easily that night could have been his last. Mick Foley felt the world offered him a canvas to create a surreal, sublime, and violent form of performance art. He desired authenticity. He desperately desired to be loved by the masses. The sacrifices he forced upon his own physique earned him the deafening roar of approval he had chased since his childhood. As we reflect on the dark side of this legendary encounter, we recognize that we will never see a spectacle quite like it again. It stands as a testament to human endurance, a monument to the dangerous pursuit of fame, and a haunting reminder of the ultimate price paid in the name of entertainment. Ladies and gentlemen, as we look back through the annals of sports entertainment, there are moments that simply entertain, and then there are moments that fundamentally alter the landscape of an entire industry. Welcome to this comprehensive retrospective. Today, we are stepping into the shadows of a structure that has broken bodies and defined legacies. We are looking at a date etched in stone, June 28, 1998. The event was the World Wrestling Federation King of the Ring Pay-Per-View. The location was the Pittsburgh Civic Arena, packed to the rafters with 16,000 screaming fans. And the match was The Undertaker versus Mankind in Hell in a Cell. To truly understand the magnitude of what transpired that night, we have to look at the psychology of the men involved, particularly the man behind a Mankind mask, Mick Foley, according to the accounts of those who know him best, including his wife Colette Foley and his daughter Noelle Foley. Mick was a man driven by a profound, almost overwhelming need for acceptance. He has stated himself that growing up, he was teased relentlessly. This created a void, a desperate need to be liked. And if he could not be loved, he realized very early on that he could elicit an entirely different, yet equally powerful reaction. Consider a story from his time as a college sophomore. According to his own recollection, he took a swig of red food coloring, climbed onto a bed, and executed a flying leap onto a stuffed item resting on a concrete floor. Upon impact, he spat the red concoction out. The reaction from the female students watching was absolute disgust. But in that disgust, Mick Foley felt power. He realized that reactions, whether they were cheers of adulation or screams of horror, were his currency. He needed to get those reactions. This psychological foundation led him to the professional wrestling industry, but not in the traditional sense. Foley was not a sculpted bodybuilder. He was not a polished, technical mastermind. He was a gladiator who utilized realism as his primary tool. He has admitted that he did not feel he had a good match unless he physically struggled to get back to his hotel room. According to his peers and producers, he did not necessarily enjoy the pain itself, but he found immense joy in his ability to endure it, to take that punishment and sell it to the audience in a way that captivated them. His journey took him to Japan, where the narrative of a match was not just man versus man, but man versus his environment. Watching up to 12 hours of Japanese wrestling tapes a day on a broken videocassette recorder in a sparsely furnished room, Foley studied the brutal art form. He became the chosen foreigner to feud with the legendary Terry Funk. According to the veterans of the industry, Terry Funk was a master at making the audience suspend their disbelief. Together, they engage in violent, explosive, bloody spectacles involving thumbtacks, barbed wire, fire, and composition for explosives. Foley was taking incredible falls onto solid concrete, pushing his body to the absolute brink. To him, bleeding on his hands and knees was proof that he had done something special. It was his way of standing out in a crowded industry. Because of this brutal, unorthodox style, Foley never envisioned himself as a World Wrestling Federation superstar. At that time, the Federation was presenting a heavily sanitized, G-rated product. It was a sterile environment, and Vince McMahon, the chairman of the company, initially had zero interest in bringing Foley on board. According to Jim Ross, who was the vice president of talent relations at the time, McMahon did not think Foley was marketable. He did not think he was attractive. McMahon's perception was that Foley was a nobody. However, Jim Ross saw something in him. He needed fresh, unpredictable opponents for The Undertaker, who was arguably the biggest star in the history of the business. Vince McMahon kept feeding Giant, lumbering men to The Undertaker, resulting in matches that were dull and uninspired. Ross knew they needed a lunatic, a dancing partner who could push The Undertaker to his absolute limits. Finally, McMahon relented, slamming his hand on a desk, but with one strict condition: they had to cover Foley's face. From that mandate, the character of Mankind was born. According to Hall of Famer Gerald Briscoe, the creative team had the monumental task of building a character out of absolutely nothing. They slapped a leather mask on him, pulled out his hair, and let him loose. But as Briscoe noted, this concept would have failed miserably with anyone other than Mick Foley. Foley possessed a rare, undeniable charisma. You simply could not take your eyes off him. Mankind and The Undertaker proceeded to lay a massive foundation. According to the records, they battled across 7 pay-per-view events and 10 television matches, traveling the globe together. But eventually, the character plateaued. Foley knew he had to do something drastic to revitalize his career and elevate their shared legacy. He did not want this next chapter to just be a minor addition. He wanted it to be historic. The producers decided to reignite the feud using a relatively new concept: Hell in a Cell. The first iteration of this match had featured Shawn Michaels and The Undertaker, and it was considered a technical masterpiece, a mile marker in the industry. Foley watched that first match with his jaw open. Realizing he could not perform the athletic feats that Michaels could, he needed a different approach. Foley pitched an idea to Vince McMahon. Traditional cage matches ended when a competitor escaped over the top or through the door. Foley asked, what if the cage had a roof? What if both men go in and only one comes out? That was the psychological hook. But the physical hook came from a passing joke made by Terry Funk. Funk laughingly suggested that they should start the match on top of the cage, and Foley should get thrown off. While Funk was joking, Foley stopped laughing. He looked at his mentor and said that he believed he could do it. The idea consumed him. He casually pitched the concept of being thrown off the cell to both The Undertaker and Vince McMahon. According to those involved, it was a phenomenal sales job. The Undertaker was extremely hesitant, not wanting to throw his opponent off a massive steel structure. But Foley was dead set, and eventually he got everyone on board. He sold them on the idea that he had been up on the cell and was comfortable with it. That was a complete fabrication. Foley was actually terrified of heights. He viewed this massive stunt not as the second act of his career, but simply as a desperate measure to keep his head above water before he retired. On the night of June 28, 1998, The atmosphere inside the Pittsburgh Civic Arena was thick with tension as the ominous structure was lowered. Announcer Jim Ross noted that the loser of this match might bypass the hospital and go straight to the morgue. No one, not the fans, not the announcers, not even the producers backstage, fully anticipated the horrifying spectacle that was about to unfold. As The Undertaker's iconic music echoed through the arena, Mankind shocked the world by immediately climbing the outside of the cell. The audience and the announcers were stunned. Jim Ross and Jerry Lawler questioned his sanity on the broadcast. Foley later admitted that as he stood on top of that cage in the dark, he was merely trying to figure out how to gracefully climb back down without ruining his career. Then, The Undertaker climbed up to meet him. The sheer physics of the situation immediately became a terrifying factor. When you have 600 pounds of human mass walking on a chain-link fence secured only by plastic zip ties, gravity becomes the ultimate enemy. As the two men took their first steps, the mesh began to sink by an entire foot. The sound of zip ties snapping echoed like gunshots. They were literally destroying the structure just by walking on it. According to the intended script, Foley was supposed to suplex The Undertaker on top of the mesh. Sensing the imminent collapse of the roof, The Undertaker cut that move off. They maneuvered toward the edge of the cage, directly above the announcer tables. Looking down from nearly 20 feet in the air, the table looked like a tiny piece of dollhouse furniture to Foley. The margin for error was virtually non-existent. If The Undertaker threw him too far or too short, he would hit solid concrete or even fall into the crowd. Then it happened. In a moment that seemed to defy time, moving in slow motion yet passing in the blink of an eye, a 300-pound man was flung from the heavens. Jim Ross, Jerry Lawler, and the Spanish broadcast team looked up in absolute horror. Hugo Savanovic, the Spanish commentator, dove out of his chair just in time. The sound of the impact was indescribable. Foley crashed violently through the table. His body, folding in a way the human spine was never designed to bend. Backstage, the reaction was pure, unfiltered panic. Former referee Jimmy Corderas, watching the monitors closely, described it as witnessing a fatal car accident. Everyone genuinely believed they had just watched a man die. There was an audible gasp of horror throughout the arena. Colette Foley, watching at home with her young children, tried to soothe them by saying it was fake, but internally, she was terrified. According to Foley, he had managed to turn his body in mid-air just enough to land flat on the desk, allowing the structure to absorb some of the impact and likely saving his life. But to the naked eye, it looked like a fatal blow. Dr. Francois Petit, the company physician who was a martial arts expert and known for his intense chiropractic adjustments, rushed to the scene. Terry Funk was the first to reach Foley's mangled body. The emergency medical technicians brought out a gurney, but it would not fit through the narrow walkway. They literally had to raise a massive steel cell, with the Undertaker still standing on top of it, just to get the medical equipment through. Foley was strapped to the gurney. The match, by all logical accounts, was over. The fans applauded respectfully, believing they had witnessed a terrifying conclusion to a dangerous experiment. But then, the most unbelievable thing happened. Foley realized that the longer he stayed on that gurney, the more the audience was emotionally investing in him. Against the screaming protests of everyone around him, against every survival instinct in the human body, Foley rolled off the gurney. He began to climb the cell again. People backstage thought he was insane. They questioned how his body was even functioning. Foley himself admitted he had no clue how he was going to continue and survive, but he had made a pledge, and he was determined to see it through. By returning to the top of the cell, he cemented himself as an absolute legend in the eyes of the fans. What followed next was a moment of pure, unplanned collateral damage. The script called for The Undertaker to execute a chokeslam on Foley, with the intention that the mesh would gradually give way and Foley would be stuffed upside down into the ring. That was not what happened. The Undertaker grabbed Foley by the throat and slammed him down. The battered mesh completely gave way, Tearing open like a paper bag, Foley plummeted straight through the roof, free-falling toward the ring below. He slammed violently onto the mat, which those in the industry describe as having almost no give, feeling akin to hitting solid cement. But the horror did not stop there. The heavy steel folding chair that had been resting on the top of the cell followed him down, striking him brutally in the face upon impact. This was the first time in his career that Mick Foley was legitimately knocked unconscious. According to the medical accounts, he lay motionless for 42 agonizing seconds. Backstage, the panic escalated from shock to absolute terror. Terry Funk, Dr. Petit, and the medical staff flooded the ring. The Undertaker looked down from the roof, his eyes conveying genuine fear, and instructed Terry Funk to check if Foley was even breathing. It was an unscripted, chaotic nightmare. Funk reported back that Foley was breathing, and then, in a brilliant piece of improvisation, Funk attacked The Undertaker to buy the medical staff crucial time. In modern sports entertainment, a match of this nature would be stopped immediately. But according to veterans in that era, they did not stop matches. They bought time. When Foley finally regained consciousness, the first thing he saw was Terry Funk's shoes. The clouds slowly began to clear from his brain. He managed to stand up, an act that defied all medical logic. According to Foley, even in his concussed state, his mind shifted to creating a television moment. He had sustained a massive puncture wound entirely through his lower lip. He deliberately stuck his tongue through the bloody hole for the cameras. He flashed a gruesome smile, revealing a missing tooth. The impact of the chair had actually knocked the tooth out, and due to his heavy breathing, he had inhaled it up his throat and into his nasal passage. A tooth was literally lodged in his nostril. The drama was entirely real. The pain was real. The expressions of concern on the faces of the officials were real. Yet, Foley insisted on finishing the match. He demanded the thumbtacks. He was slammed into thousands of steel tacks, purposely rolling around to ensure they stuck in his flesh. When the adrenaline takes over, the pain becomes a secondary entity. He pushed himself far beyond the limits of human endurance. Finally, after 17 minutes of unadulterated brutality, The Undertaker pinned Mankind. The match was over. The crowd of 16,000 went absolutely insane. They knew they had witnessed a man risk his actual life for their entertainment, and that level of sacrifice bonded the audience to Mick Foley forever. The physical toll was catastrophic. When Foley arrived backstage, Vince McMahon, the man who once thought Foley was unemployable, thanked him for everything he had done for the company, but firmly demanded that he promise never to do anything like that again. Foley was so disoriented that he asked The Undertaker if they had remembered to use the thumbtacks, completely oblivious to the fact that the medical staff was currently plucking dozens of them out his back. According to the injury reports, Foley suffered 15 stitches underneath his lip, lost 2 teeth, sustained a bruised kidney that bothered him for 6 weeks, and suffered a dislocated jaw and a dislocated shoulder. It is not even clear if he was formally treated for severe concussion he undoubtedly sustained. But the emotional and psychological fallout extended far beyond the arena. Colette Foley had been waiting anxiously for a phone call. When he finally called hours later, she screamed at him, revealing that his children had thought he was dead. The trust that he would not jeopardize his family for his career was shattered. Despite the warnings from McMahon and the terror of his family, the bar had been raised, and Foley felt immense pressure to live up to his moniker as the hardcore legend. The limits of human physical endurance became his canvas, according to his peers. He felt a deep obligation to over-deliver for the audience and his opponents. Just 7 months later, Foley found himself in another terrifying situation, the infamous I Quit match against The Rock. This match was designed to be brutal, but it spiraled completely out of control. Foley was handcuffed, rendering him unable to protect himself. According to the original plan, he was supposed to take 5 unprotected chair shots to the head. Instead, in the heat of the moment, he instructed The Rock to lay it in. He ultimately absorbed 11 horrific, unprotected strikes to the skull with a solid steel chair. His family was ringside. His children watched their father being brutally beaten. The fiction of sports entertainment bled into terrifying reality. According to the accounts, Foley suffered legitimate brain damage for a television storyline. His daughter Noelle later reflected on the sickening nature of the match, noting that a normal person could have died from 11 direct blows to the head. The collateral damage of these decisions is profound. According to medical professionals who evaluated Foley later in his career, the accumulation of trauma was staggering. Concussion upon concussion. He reached a point where he would drive his car and forget where he lived. After a WWE neurologist appointment went poorly, he sought an independent evaluation. The doctor's words were chillingly final. He advised Foley to never wrestle again. The specter of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, a terrifying degenerative brain disease caused by repetitive trauma, looms large over his life. Noelle Foley has openly admitted that she worries every single day about what her father's cognitive state will be in 10 or 20 years. Mick Foley himself acknowledges a fear of the unknown regarding his neurological health. To combat the cognitive decline, he engages in spoken word tours, describing them as mental gymnastics to keep his mind sharp. In the years following Hell in a Cell, Foley harbored a deep resentment toward the match. He had accomplished so much in the industry, yet he felt he was only defined by those terrifying falls. He spent time in a dark place, wrestling with his legacy. It was a conversation with The Undertaker that shifted his perspective. The Undertaker told him that what they created that night would outlive them both. During a visit to the World Wrestling Entertainment warehouse, Foley and his daughter unexpectedly came across the original cell structure. According to Noelle, her father reached out, touched the steel, and began to weep. It was a profound realization of mortality, a recognition of how close he came to losing everything for the roar of the crowd. Was it all worth it? It is a complex question with no easy answer. Foley admits that there is no monetary or professional reward substantial enough to justify risking your life. Furthermore, according to his own admissions, even knowing what the medical community now knows about brain injuries, he cannot say with absolute certainty that he would have done things differently. The industry offered him a massive canvas, and he used his own body as the paint to create what he describes as a real, sublime performance art. He desired authenticity. He desperately wanted to be loved. He sacrificed his physical well-being, enduring catastrophic injuries, all for the intoxicating roar of total strangers. According to those who analyze the history of sports entertainment, Mick Foley gave his heart, his soul, and a significant portion of his physical health to the business. The fans remain in awe of him because he proved that there are no limits to what a man will endure to secure his place in history. He survived Hell in a Cell, but as the documents and personal testimonies suggest, he will be paying the physical and psychological toll for the rest of his life. It was a dangerously crazy masterpiece, a testament to the human will, and a somber cautionary tale about the true cost of immortality in the squared circle. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to a profound exploration of a moment that forever altered the landscape of professional wrestling. I have sat ringside for decades, calling the action for the World Wrestling Federation, World Championship Wrestling, Extreme Championship Wrestling, and beyond. I have seen the triumphs, the tragedies, and the unbelievable spectacles that define this industry. But if you ask anyone who has spent their life in this business about the most shocking, paradigm-shifting night in sports entertainment history, all roads lead to one date, June 28, 1998. The setting was the King of the Ring pay-per-view event. The match was Hell in a Cell. The combatants were The Undertaker and Mankind. To understand the magnitude of this event, we cannot merely look at the physical destruction. We must dive deep into the psychology of the man behind a Mankind mask. Mick Foley. According to those who know him best, including his wife Colette and his daughter Noelle, Mick was not your traditional athlete. He was a man driven by a complex, almost overwhelming need for acceptance. As Mick himself recalled, his journey began long before the bright lights of the global stage. During his sophomore year of college, desperate to elicit a reaction from his peers, He filled his mouth with red food coloring and launched himself off a bed onto a stuffed animal on a concrete floor. The revulsion and shock of the onlookers did not deter him. It empowered him. It planted a seed in his mind. If he could not command traditional admiration, he would command all through absolute, undeniable sacrifice. This philosophy birthed a career built on pain. Long before he stepped into the World Wrestling Federation, Foley traveled the globe, pushing the boundaries of physical endurance. Testimonies from his time in Japan reveal a man willing to subject himself to barbed wire, concrete floors, and even C4 explosives, often alongside his mentor, the legendary Terry Funk. Foley sought the raw, visceral realism of survival against his environment. He did not mind the pain. He relished his ability to absorb it and channel it into a story that captivated audiences. Yet, as investigative records of the time show, the corporate leadership at the World Wrestling Federation, specifically Chairman Vince McMahon, was initially resistant. McMahon's vision during that general audience's rated era favored traditional titans. According to former Vice President of Talent Relations Jim Ross and producer Jim Cornette, McMahon viewed Foley as unmarketable. It was only through the persistent advocacy of Jim Ross, who recognized the desperate need for an unpredictable, chaotic foil to the legendary Undertaker, that Foley was given a chance. But there was a condition. McMahon insisted that Foley's face be covered. From this corporate mandate, the tormented, deranged character of Mankind was born. By the summer of 1998, Mankind and The Undertaker had battled across the globe, sharing 7 pay-per-view matches and 10 television matches. But Foley felt his character had hit a ceiling. He needed a masterpiece. He needed to escalate the violence to a level that would cement his legacy. The vehicle for this escalation was a Hell in a Cell structure, a brutal enclosure with roof, designed to ensure neither man could escape. Only one such match had occurred prior, a critically acclaimed bout between The Undertaker and Shawn Michaels. Foley, fully aware of his physical limitations compared to the incredible athleticism of Michaels, turned to Terry Funk for advice. In a passing joke, Funk suggested starting the match on top of the cage and getting thrown off. While Funk laughed, Foley saw a blueprint. According to backstage accounts, pitching this idea was an uphill battle. The Undertaker was extremely reluctant. McMahon needed convincing. Foley, however, was resolute. He viewed this match not as a stepping stone, but as a potential swan song, a final, definitive spectacle to keep his career afloat. When the lights went down at the Pittsburgh Civic Arena, a sold-out crowd of 16,000 fans had no idea they were about to witness a live sacrifice. On the monitors backstage, industry veterans like Gerald Briscoe and referee Jimmy Corderas watched with bated breath as Mankind made his entrance. He bypassed the door and climbed directly to the top of the towering structure. I must emphasize the sheer terror of this reality. Foley had never practiced this. He later admitted a profound fear of heights. Yet, he stood on top of a mesh roof suspended almost 20 feet above the concrete arena floor. When The Undertaker joined him, the weight of over 600 pounds of human mass compromised the structure. The zip ties securing the mesh began to snap. The roof sagged dangerously. Then came the moment that is burned into the collective memory of the wrestling world. As the men brawled near the edge, The Undertaker grabbed Mankind and hurled him over the abyss. Time seemed to stand still. We watched a 300-pound man plummet through the air, crashing violently through the Spanish announcer's table. The sound of the impact was deafening. Commentator Hugo Savinovic barely escaped being crushed. Backstage, the atmosphere shifted from entertainment to absolute horror. The consensus among the locker room and the production truck was unanimous. They believed they had just watched a man die on live television. Medical personnel, including Dr. Francois Petit, flooded the ringside area. A stretcher was brought out. The match, by all logical and medical standards, was over. Foley was strapped down, heavily damaged, with a dislocated shoulder. The audience fell into a stunned silence. But then, the unbelievable happened. Fighting off the medical staff, A battered, broken Mick Foley rose from the stretcher. Driven by an adrenaline-fueled devotion to his craft and his audience, he began to climb the cell once more. What followed was a second, and perhaps more dangerous, catastrophe of the night. It was an event that no one had planned. As The Undertaker executed a choke slam on the roof of the cage, the already weakened mesh completely gave way. Foley plummeted directly down to the wooden ring canvas below. He did not have a table to break his fall. He hit the unforgiving mat with sickening force, and to make matters worse, a heavy steel folding chair fell directly onto his face. According to eyewitnesses in the ring, Foley was legitimately knocked unconscious. For 42 agonizing seconds, he did not respond. The Undertaker looked down from the roof, breaking character to check if his opponent was still breathing. Terry Funk rushed into the ring, intentionally taking physical contact from The Undertaker, simply to buy the medical team time to assess Foley. In modern sports entertainment, a match under these circumstances would be stopped immediately. But this was a different era. Foley regained consciousness, his face a mask of blood. In a display of almost frightening dedication to his character, he smiled for the cameras, revealing that one of his teeth had been knocked completely out of his mouth and lodged into his nasal passage. Foley refused to quit. He retrieved a bag of thumbtacks, scattering them across the mat, and intentionally subjected his own broken body to them. When the 17-minute match finally concluded, The Undertaker emerged victorious, but mankind had achieved a twisted form of immortality. The immediate aftermath was a complex mix of gratitude and terror. Backstage, Vince McMahon approached Foley, thanked him for his incredible sacrifice, but sternly warned him never to do anything like it again. Foley's injuries were staggering. 15 stitches, 2 lost teeth, a dislocated jaw, a dislocated shoulder, and a kidney bruised so badly he suffered for 6 weeks. At home, his wife, Colette, was furious and terrified, realizing the very real danger her husband was willingly courting. Yet, the investigative timeline shows that this match was not the end of Foley's dangerous trajectory. It catalyzed a career renaissance, propelling him to the World Wrestling Federation Championship just 6 months later. The roar of the crowd had become an addiction, and the bar for extreme violence had been raised to an impossible height. This desperate need to over-deliver culminated 7 months later in an I Quit match against The Rock. The script called for a sequence of steel chair strikes to the head. Foley had instructed his opponent not to hold back. However, the sequence escalated far beyond the planned 5 strikes, resulting in Foley taking 11 unprotected blows to the skull while his hands were cuffed behind his back. Today, we look back at these events through the sobering lens of medical science. We now understand severe, irreversible consequences of concussions and chronic traumatic encephalopathy. Documents and medical consultations reveal that Foley was unequivocally advised by an independent neurologist to never wrestle again due to severe brain trauma. The legacy of Hell in a Cell is a complicated tapestry. It is a masterpiece of storytelling and endurance, yet it serves as a grim cautionary tale. Foley's daughter, Noelle, admits she struggles to watch her father's matches, living with the daily anxiety of what the next 10 or 20 years might hold for his cognitive health. Foley himself utilizes spoken word tours as mental gymnastics to fight the cognitive decline he knows is looming. Years later, while visiting the corporate archives, Foley laid his hand on the rusted steel of the original cell. According to those present, the legendary hardcore icon broke down in tears. It was a profound moment of reflection, a realization of the terrifying proximity he had to his own demise. Mick Foley achieved his dream. He earned the love and awe of millions. He created moments that will outlive everyone who witnessed them. But as we close the book on the darkest, most dangerous night in sports entertainment, we are left with a haunting, unresolved question. A question every athlete who trades their physical future for a moment of glory must ultimately answer. Was it worth it? Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. I have sat at ringside for decades, calling the action witnessing the triumphs and the tragedies of this industry. I have lent my voice to broadcast for the World Wrestling Federation World Championship Wrestling, Extreme Championship Wrestling, total nonstop action, all elite wrestling. And I have spent countless hours analyzing the deepest, darkest corners of the squared circle for investigative programs like Dark Side of the Ring. But tonight, we're going to look back at a singular moment in time, a moment that forever altered the landscape of professional wrestling. A night where the line between sports entertainment and terrifying reality was not just blurred, but completely erased. We are talking about June 28th, 1998. The World Wrestling Federation's King of the Ring pay-per-view event. The match was Hell in a Cell. The combatants, The Undertaker and Mankind. To truly understand what happened in that steel structure, you have to understand the psychology of the man behind the Mankind mask. You have to understand Mick Foley. Everyone who gets into professional wrestling business is looking for something that they find missing in their own lives. According to Foley himself, he was teased heavily in his youth, which created an overwhelming, almost desperate need to be liked and accepted by those around him. According to the stories he has shared, this need manifested early. While he was a sophomore in college, Foley orchestrated a stunt to captivate his peers. He took a swig of red food coloring and executed a flying leap off a bed, crashing onto a stuffed dummy positioned on a hard concrete floor. Upon impact, he spat the fake blood from his mouth. The reaction from the watching dorm mates was pure shock, with one girl calling it the most disgusting thing she had ever seen. In that moment, Mick Foley discovered profound truth about himself. If he could not make people love him through traditional means, he could command their attention, and perhaps their admiration, by disgusting and shocking them. He needed a reaction, and that need would drive him to the absolute brink. As Foley transitioned into the professional wrestling industry, he adopted a persona known as Cactus Jack. He was a wild, unhinged brawler. Fans legitimately questioned his sanity. He possessed a unique charisma that made it impossible to look away. Jim Cornette, a veteran manager and producer who was working for the World Wrestling Federation at the time of Hell in a Cell, noted that Foley was a master of ring psychology. He understood that audiences gravitated toward a performer who appeared completely out of control, a man who seemed to throw the script out the window. By taking the fans on that unpredictable ride, Foley ensured all eyes were on him, and his reputation as a hardcore legend began to solidify. But it was not a conventional path. Foley's dedication to realism bordered on masochism. He once stated that he did not feel he had a good match unless he physically struggled to walk back to his hotel room. It was not that he enjoyed the physical agony, but rather he enjoyed his ability to endure it and sell it to the audience in a way that captivated them. His early career was heavily influenced by the grueling, ultra-violent death matches of Japan. According to those close to him, including his wife Colette Foley, their early life together featured a bedroom with nothing but a mattress on the floor and a black and white television connected to a faulty video cassette recorder. On that screen, Foley would watch up to 12 hours of Japanese wrestling a day. He was drawn to the realism and the intense storytelling, where a wrestler did not just have to defeat their opponent, but also their dangerous surroundings. He found a mentor in the legendary Terry Funk, a master making audiences suspend their disbelief. Together, they engaged in explosive, bloody encounters in Japan, utilizing barbed wire and composition for explosives. Foley firmly believed that this violent niche would be his permanent home in the industry, far away from the bright, polished lights of the mainstream American promotions. At that time, the World Wrestling Federation was firmly rooted in a general audience-rated era. It was a sanitized, highly produced environment, and Vince McMahon, the chairman of the company, had absolutely no interest in Mick Foley. According to industry insiders, McMahon viewed Foley as unmarketable and unattractive, a performer whose gritty style fundamentally clashed with the corporate image. However, Jim Ross, the vice president of talent relations at the time, saw something unique. Ross needed compelling challengers for the company's biggest star, The Undertaker. McMahon had continually positioned Giant, lumbering opponents against The Undertaker, which often resulted in slow, uninspiring matches. Ross argued that what The Undertaker truly needed was a lunatic, a completely unpredictable foil. Finally, McMahon relented, slamming his hand on a table and agreeing to hire Foley. But under one strict condition: they had to cover his face. McMahon wanted a character completely devoid of Foley's past identity. And from that corporate mandate, the character of Mankind was born. Gerald Briscoe, a legendary competitor and producer, recalled the immense challenge of building a character out of essentially nothing. Yet, Foley took this bizarre, deranged concept, a masked man who pulled out his own hair and shrieked in the boiler room, and made it connect with the audience. Without Foley's total commitment, the Mankind character would have been a catastrophic failure. The Undertaker and Mankind engaged in a legendary rivalry, battling across 7 pay-per-view events and 10 television matches. But as 1998 approached, Foley felt his character had plateaued. He needed something extraordinary to revitalize his career and solidify their legacy. The stage was set for King of the Ring. The producers planned to reignite the feud using the Hell in a Cell concept, a massive roof cage that had only been utilized once before in a classic bout between The Undertaker and Shawn Michaels. Foley watched that first match in awe, knowing he could not match their athletic prowess. He consulted his mentor, Terry Funk, searching for a way to stand out. Funk jokingly suggested that they should start the match on top of the cage, and that Foley should be thrown off. What was meant as a dark joke became an obsession for Foley. He pitched the idea to McMahon and The Undertaker. The Undertaker was highly reluctant to throw a human being off a structure of that height, but Foley's persistence eventually wore them down. Foley viewed this dangerous stunt not as a way to launch a second act of his career, but merely as a desperate attempt to keep his head above water before he stepped away from the ring for good. When the night of June 28th arrived in the Pittsburgh Civic Arena, 16,000 fans packed the building. Completely unaware of the terrifying spectacle that was about to unfold, Jimmy Corderas, a referee and ring crew member, watched the monitors backstage alongside producer Gerald Briscoe, noting the palpable tension. As Mankind's music hit, the audience expected him to enter the structure. Instead, to the absolute shock of the commentators and the crowd, Foley began scaling the outside of the massive steel mesh. The Undertaker soon followed. The visual was stunning, but the reality was terrifying. Foley later admitted he was actually afraid of heights. Furthermore, the construction of the cage was not designed to support the 600 pounds of weight shifting across its roof. As they took their first steps, the mesh began to buckle. The zip ties holding the panels together began springing loose with loud snaps. Foley attempted to execute a maneuver on the roof, but The Undertaker quickly stopped it, realizing the very real danger of the roof collapsing beneath them. They brawled toward the edge, positioning themselves directly above the Spanish announcer's desk. No one, not even the seasoned veterans backstage, believed Foley would actually take the fall. Then it happened. The Undertaker grabbed Mankind and hurled his 300-pound body off the edge, sending him plummeting nearly 20 feet through the air. He crashed violently through the Spanish announce table. Hugo Savanovic, the Spanish commentator, narrowly bailed out his chair to avoid being crushed. The sound of the impact was sickening. It did not sound like sports entertainment. It sounded like a catastrophic car accident. Backstage, the locker room erupted in absolute panic. The general consensus among the wrestlers and producers was that they had just watched a man die on live television. At ringside, complete chaos reigned. Terry Funk was the first to reach Foley's lifeless body, desperately checking for consciousness. Dr. Francois Petit, the company physician known for his unconventional but effective methods, sprinted from the medical room. He found Foley in a devastating state, having landed terribly on his back and dislocating his shoulder. Emergency medical technicians rushed the gurney to the wreckage. The The match was seemingly over. The audience watched in stunned silence as the broken body of Mankind was strapped down and wheeled up the aisle. But then, in a moment that defies logic and medical advice, Foley rolled off the gurney. Aides and officials screamed at him to stop, pleading with him to go to the hospital, but the adrenaline had taken over. He saw the reaction of the crowd and felt an overwhelming compulsion to finish what he had started. Foley broke away, marching back to the ring and scaling the cell a second time. If the first fall was a carefully calculated, albeit insane, stunt, the second fall was a complete, unmitigated disaster. Once back on top, the plan was for The Undertaker to perform a chokeslam on Foley, safely tearing a hole in the mesh to create a dramatic visual. However, as The Undertaker drove Foley into the roof, the entire steel panel gave way. Foley plummeted through the ceiling, falling freely into the ring below. Unlike the first fall, which was somewhat cushioned by the breakaway table, this time Foley slammed directly onto the hard, unforgiving ring mat, which is essentially a thin layer of padding over solid wood and steel beams, to make matters infinitely worse. A heavy steel folding chair that had been resting on top of the cage followed him down, striking him directly in the face upon impact. This was not part of the plan. Backstage, panic turned to sheer terror. Even The Undertaker broke character, peering down through the broken roof in genuine fear for his opponent's life. Foley was not completely unconscious. It was the first time in his career he had been legitimately knocked out cold, losing 42 seconds of memory. The ring filled with personnel, including Terry Funk, who desperately tried to communicate with Foley. Seeing Foley's unresponsive eyes, The Undertaker instructed Funk to see if he was even breathing. In an incredible display of instinct, Funk initiated a brief physical altercation with The Undertaker in the ring, desperately buying time for the doctors to tend to Foley. According to all protocols, the match should have been immediately stopped. But in that era of the industry, matches were rarely halted. Slowly, miraculously, Foley regained consciousness. His face was a horrific mass of trauma. He had suffered a massive laceration under his lip. The steel chair had knocked his teeth out, lodging one of them inside his nasal passage, a gruesome detail caught by the television cameras as Foley bizarrely smiled through the blood. Despite suffering a dislocated jaw, a dislocated shoulder, a bruised kidney, 15 facial stitches, and a severe concussion, Foley continued the match. In a final act of agonizing endurance, Foley introduced thousands of metal thumbtacks to the ring mat, taking multiple falls directly onto the sharp points before The Undertaker mercifully secured the victory, ending the 17-minute ordeal. The crowd roared in a mixture of awe, respect, and horror. Vince McMahon greeted Foley behind the curtain, thanking him for his sacrifice, but strictly warning him to never attempt anything like that again. Foley's wife, Colette, who had been watching from home with their children, endured hours of agonizing silence before Foley finally called to assure her he was alive, facing her entirely justified anger and terror. The Hell in a Cell match catapulted McFoley into superstardom, eventually leading to him capturing the World Championship. But it also set a dangerous precedent. The bar for violence had been raised to an impossible height, and Foley felt a constant, overwhelming pressure to live up to his reputation as a hardcore legend. Just 7 months later, Foley clashed with The Rock in an